Okay, there are a few hot topics going on in the EUC world, so I wanted to make this video out now. So, you're interested in the new suspension wheels, and you're wondering whether you should buy the S18 or the Inmotion V11. And it does seem like a tough choice. They are aimed for slightly different use cases, but that is not the factor that you should be looking at when choosing. Let me explain. I will go through a few key points on how they compare. Well, first, looks. There are enough videos around to show you how they look. They are both a bit different when you see them in person, but still, it's a personal thing. I think that since I'm not watching the wheel that much when I ride, that it's not that very important, but for some people it is, and I respect that. One thing I noticed though, that when I first saw the S18 being ridden, it didn't look like the rider was supposed to stand on the wheel. It looks strange, it looks off. I can totally see why some people think that the V11 looks like a moving character or something. But when it's ridden, it looks like a very compact motorcycle. But this is a personal opinion only, and there's nothing I can do to help you make up your mind. Fit, how it is put together. And here's where the V11 was a huge surprise to me. If you watched my first impressions video, you may remember me saying that it doesn't feel like an electric unicycle. It just feels like a motorcycle. There's something very different in how every single part of the wheel is solid, doesn't flop around. The first thing I noticed about the MSX was when I opened the pedals. They're very loose and they rattle down and slam down to the lowest position. And the lack of design and the lack of quality felt so obvious. And the V11 is like an absolute opposite. The pedals go down smoothly. There's this hinge mechanism on them, a bit same kind that you see on laptops. Everything is just so sturdy and solid. Especially the trolley handle. It's much more solid than on any other EUC. My expectations about the S18 were not very high since I have watched many reviews and I knew about some of the issues that it is having. But still, the S18, how it's put together, it was a disappointment immediately. The handle rattles, the panels are floppy, and the fender, it's a very loose plastic. And it flaps around easily, and the pads don't quite fit correctly on the corners of the wheel, which is why they don't stick, I think. To me, it has a prototype feel all over. Riding comfort. The V11 has very wide pedals, but since I'm used to pedal extensions, my shoe size is EU46. The pedals first felt a bit short to me, but I'm getting used to them, so I don't think it's a real issue. The sides of the wheel are flat and the top saddle is cushioned, so there is nothing pointy to hurt you while you lean on it. The vertical panel on the side is a bit narrow at the lowest part, but it's easily enough to add padding if you want. And I made a video on how I made the jump pads for my V11. All the pads in the S18 are hard and narrow on the production version, meaning narrow from the highest part to the lowest part. So it presses on your leg on a very small area only. And every rider in our group who tried the S18 felt that the contours do not fit their legs or riding style at all, so they couldn't use the jump pads. I couldn't get it up in the air at all. And the S18 pedals are quite narrow. So, to the handling. The S18 will feel more familiar to riders, at least at first, because the suspension is so stiff, and on most situations it handles like a non-suspension wheel. But the ride on the V11 is completely new. If you are at Chooch level with your skills, then you can surely utilize the suspension in a very different manner. But it's not the same for an average Joe or just a seasoned road rider. The V11 is a whole new ball game for every single rider and every single riding situation, since it separates you from the road. It floats. It floats over every bump, every curve, everything. And no one has experienced that before, so it's not familiar to anyone. And there's a lot of stuff to learn, especially when taking the V11 to the extremes, because it handles differently on roots and rocks, for example. I have had to step off a few times when I was using the technique I learned on the MSX when going over curves and very tough parts on the forest paths, also when going up shallow stairs. The firmware, of course, behaves a bit differently, but it is very easy to get used to, because you have the slider for the pedal sensitivity, so you have 200 riding modes, when on other wheels you have 3, so you get to have the response you want. Riding up the shallow stairs on the V11 requires a completely new technique that still messes with my brain. I can't do it very well. I have ridden for so long and so much on the MSX that I know quite precisely how it handles on any situation without thinking about it. The S18 suspension, it fits that skill set directly, and I could just push a bit further with it. So I can see how it feels familiar, yet offers a bit of safety on the large bumps. V11 is definitely the one that starts the new era of suspension wheels, because that's where the comfort is. Some reviews have said that if you have the V11 as your first wheel, you will learn a lousy technique. And they might be right, because the riding technique you learn on the V11, it doesn't translate to any other wheel. If you learn on a non-suspension wheel, you can hop on the V11 and be amazed right away. If you learn on the S18, it will be quite close to how you would ride on a non-suspension wheel. Then about the safety. Both wheels will help you a lot if you hit a large pothole. The difference is that the V11 makes it comfortable as well. What I learned at the third day is that a rider's concentration is allowed to be at a different place on the V11. You don't have to scan the road that hard anymore. So you can look at the traffic, you can look where you are, you can look around you, you can enjoy the scenery, the nature, it's all good. And that's one thing that makes the ride on the V11 so enjoyable. I was mentally much more present, much more out of my head, much more out of the immediate road right in front of me. On the S18, you have the added safety at potholes and large bumps, but you're still scanning the road because hitting anything smaller still gives you a jolt, and it shakes you and makes you tired much sooner. One example on the V11 is a cobblestone road that has really bad bumps from frost in the winter, and it has speed bumps. And I can ride that road without looking down. It's an incredible feeling, and it's not something that I would do, but I could do. I couldn't imagine doing that on the S18, not by a long shot. So while the V11 separates the riding feeling from the road, it also separates you from worrying about the road. One local rider who has ridden thousands of miles on the 16X just messaged me a week after he had tried my V11. And he wrote that he still can't ride his 16X without thinking about the V11. That's how big of a deal it is. No one who buys the V11 is going to be disappointed with the suspension, no matter what you are expecting, if you take the time to find out which pressures fit your style and your weight. But many of those who have bought the S18 have been disappointed with the suspension, and here is why. For the last days, the discussions have been very active on the Electric Unicycle forum, and at the same time I've been helping a local rider to get the suspension on his S18 to be more sensitive. And what people all over the world have found out, and what we found out, was that every single moving part on the S18 suspension has way too much friction, and none of them moved correctly, even when the shock taken physically out of the system. It still took 2 men to move it up and down. And if it got to the end position, we couldn't move it even with the full force of 2 men. And the reasons are coming out. There's a metal block under the pedal that you're supposed to use only when assembling the wheel. But the assemblers didn't know that, so they left it on. So it bends the lowest part of the pedal structure so it doesn't fit the spacing of the vertical tubes. So it doesn't move up and down. KingSong has now made a video to show how to remove the block, and it's an easy thing to remove. So that helps a lot with the sliding tubes. Then there are the bearings and the hinges of the linkage system, and every section of that part has been assembled wrong. There are parts being tightened up very tightly against each other, which shouldn't be touching at all, so the bearings don't do anything. To fix one of the hinges to add a smaller washer that spreads out the bolt length, so the hinge can move more freely. But the other hinges are not done right either. On one hinge there is a spring-loaded washer that is leaning against the bearing, making it very hard for it to move properly. And these things go all over on every joint. If you add the washers and if you lube everything up really well, it will turn to a very different kind of suspension. But it still won't work as it is designed. And for that, the tips and the techniques to make it work are only starting to come out. So I can't tell which one would be the most practical and the smartest. Anyway, if you buy the S18, you have to be doing a lot of work with the suspension to get it to even work. We have spent many hours with the local guy on his S18, and he continued by himself and taking it to the tech guys at his work. And it's now starting to work a bit. But I really wouldn't call the suspension action comfortable, because all the smaller and some medium-sized bumps come right through to my legs. So it's only on the bigger bumps that it's working. Okay, if you work all those things out and the suspension works perfectly, then what? Well, then there is the misaligned tire and the loose fender that's dragging on the shell of the wheel, and the handle, it's very loose. There's nothing that can be tightened to make it tighter. So it makes a lot of noise on every bump, while the V11 is dead silent until you go down like stairs or large curves. When the suspension reaches the end position, there's a rubber stopper, but it does make a sound, and then when your legs hit the pedals again and the tire hits the pavement and stuff like that, they do make noise. And then there's the motor cable issue on the S18. The axle comes quite close to the rider's foot, and like on traditional wheels, a motor cable comes out from the center of the axle. So it has a steep bend and then it's pulled back under the covers. And the part where it's exposed, it does have a very thin and flexible spring which is supposed to protect the rubber cable. For some reason, the motor cable on a 1 week old S18 had started to pull out and bulge a bit. And there's a part of the outer shell that goes up and down right in front of the cable. And when the cable is out a bit too far, the shell is dragging directly on the cable. And I don't know how KingSong is going to fix that one, other than replace a lot of motors in a year when the cables have all worn out. And then there's the control board. On consumer electronics, it came a fashion somewhere in the 80s to solder the connectors directly on the circuit board. So they are only supported by the soldering that carries the signal also. And whatever stress you put on the connector, there will be an outer shell or a casing that is supposed to keep the connector in place, but it only keeps it at front, and the connector is not fixed to the shell or cover. So every little movement you make on the cable, it moves the soldered connections, and in time they often crack. I have repaired quite a few guitar amplifiers, and on the cheapest amps where the connectors are directly on the board, that's the number one thing that goes. And on the S18, the connectors are, and even the rear light, just soldered in directly on the main board. So the current situation is that every single S18 that leaves the factory has been assembled wrong, and the suspension system doesn't work at all like it was designed to do. So now is the wrong time to buy the S18. The situation may be very different in a month. We don't know what KingSong will do to fix their mistake, and nobody knows what they will do to the ones who have already bought the wheel. Either way, it's a mess that I don't think you should take part. Now, there has been issues with the V11 as well. But so far, every major issue I've read about has been present only on 1 or 2 units. 1 or 2 units. For example, the bearing issue on Duff's wheel, single incident. No one else of the hundreds of V11s that have been sent out had bearing issues that we know of. Yet they changed the product line and they now ship with better bearings. One V11 user had an issue with the motor, making strange sounds, and he's getting a new motor, and Inmotion is investigating the issue and is in talks with the motor supplier. And some of you know that the main board on my V11 fried, and I got a message from DHL that the new main board that I got on warranty, that it will be here on Monday, which is exactly 7 days after I first contacted Inmotion about having a fried board. I'm a heavyweight guy. I love to ride steep hills. I have fried 3 or 4 main boards before this one. So there's not necessarily even anything wrong with the wheel. But there might be something seriously wrong with how I try to ride the wheels. All of these are just a fraction of a percent of the wheels that have been sent out. There is one issue that concerns every V11, and it's the brackets on the saddle that attach the saddle to the frame. The issue is that the brackets are thin plastic and it will break easily. The bolts that the brackets attach to are something that I have forgotten to put back on many times. It doesn't affect riding, it doesn't make additional noises. I can only notice it when I pull the wheel from the saddle. Then I notice that, oh, it moves. So that's really not a big issue in my books. And they are changing the product line again so that the brackets will be made of metal. And the warranty covers all these. If your saddle brackets have cracked, you will get new saddles. I would wait until they come out with the metal inserts before applying for the warranty. So the amount and severity of the issues, it's not comparable at all. And for further KingSong issues, it's the locking issue. They started to remotely lock KingSong wheels if they have a certain letter in the serial number that dictates that it's meant for China markets only. So if you have bought your wheel from AliExpress or places like that, there's a good chance that you have a wheel that will be locked if you connect it to the KingSong app, no matter when you bought it. I bought my wheel 3 years ago and it got locked. And due to community pressure, they changed their policy so that if the wheel is bought, I think it was before July or before August this year, then you can reach out KingSong customer support and they will remotely unlock your wheel. And it will take 3 to 4 days. So even if your wheel is okay, you might have to be without riding for 3 or 4 days. Also, I've read about a few people that have bought a KingSong wheel from a physical store. One was in Stockholm and the wheel was a China wheel, so it got locked. And someone wrote about a wheel that doesn't have the P in the serial number, but it was still locked. I don't know how that turned out, but that's a horrible mess. Dozens of riders have started boycotting KingSong because of this. They don't think it's a fair approach. Even in a legal sense, when you buy a wheel, no matter where you buy it, it's your own property. And if someone makes it unoperable, that's vandalism. They don't have to write. What the Inmotion technique is, they also have those mainland China wheels, but they will not connect to the app in the first place outside the China. So when you get your wheel, if it is meant to be sold only in China, you can't connect your app to it at all. And I think that's a fair approach, since at that point you complain to your seller that this wheel doesn't work. But I haven't read about a single Inmotion wheel that would have had this issue. So their technique works. AliExpress and other places, they don't sell China Inmotions. But the China KingSongs are all over. So again, if you're considering KingSong, might be a good time to wait right now. And if you don't want to support that kind of behavior towards customers, maybe don't buy a KingSong at all. I know that I'm going to be flamed for this video, but this is a message that had to be said, since the people at the forum are only part of the community, so the message may not spread otherwise. But here you go. If you want more details, go to forum.electricunicycle.org and read what's going on. Okay, more V11 videos next week. Take care.